Hello, and welcome to Good News Rhode Island, GoodNEWSRI, the show about Providence and Rhode Island and the people and places and events that make it a great place to live. There are many people who come in and out of Rhode Island who lend a lot to us, who create events where we all learn about each other and new things about the world around us. And one of those people this past week has been Naomi Nye, who's here from Texas, who's here to work with Moses Brown School, but also with the Block Island Poetry Project here in Rhode Island. Welcome, Naomi, and thank you so much for giving us this interview. We're thrilled to have you here.
My pleasure. Thank you, Juliana.
It's hard to say all the things that Naomi does, but I would say that she is an internationally known poet who has been working very hard for understanding, for dialogue between peoples of differences, particularly for Palestinians and Israelis. And that particular focus has maybe drawn you into poetry more than you might have been otherwise, because you're helping people to write as well as writing yourself. So maybe we could start by you introducing yourself to say, how did you start writing, and when did you know at first that this might be what you were going to be doing with your life?
I started writing as a small child. I fell in love with the sound of poetry even before I could read. And by the time I was 7, frequenting the school library in St. Louis, where I was born and first lived, a friendly librarian showed me there were magazines which would accept work by children. If I wanted to share my poems, send them in. And that seemed like a pleasant thing to do. So I actually began sending work out as a 7-year-old, and never being shy to share work, always looking for other people who were interested in writing, and just having a wonderful life of it. I never thought of writing as being my future career or an ambition. It was simply a meaningful activity that gave me pleasure and gave me calm, and I loved reading it just as much as writing it. And so I felt very lucky as a teenager to have that regular passion of writing, found many other teens who did too. And by the time I was in college, I think, I knew that whatever else I did in my life, writing would be a central devotion. I think of it as a devotion or an addiction, but not so much a career.
It's unusual that you found other students that were writing poetry.
Well, I always offered up my services to any literary magazine that might be going on, or created reading space on stage for the students in high schools, and these days that would be considered a common thing to do. I think that happens more now, but even back in the late 60s when I was in high school, it was maybe not in public high schools as much. I did go to 1 year of high school in Jerusalem, and was also very actively involved in writing there. To me, it seemed if you would share your love for what you did, other people would materialize and say, I like that too, or I do that too. You couldn't keep it in your drawer in a closet. And so there's been never a dearth of writing companions along the way.
You have such an amazing sense of community and sort of the humanity of those around you that I very much admire.
Well, that's so sweet of you to say, and I do feel a very strong sense of community in Rhode Island. I've come here at least 3 or 4 times to do different things, and have always enjoyed the people I met. I went to the Moses Brown School on this trip. I also went there 10 years ago, and they have a poetry series. I saw some of the same wonderful teachers I saw 10 years ago, Ransom Griffin and other faculty. The students are very tuned into poetry at Moses Brown, and also to activism and advocacy. So I really enjoyed being there. On this particular trip, I also had a chance to work with the fantastic Raise Your Voice project that has been started by Risa Gilpin and Dorothy Boshin, and they're working with quite a few public schools in Providence with writing, connection, community activism, nonviolence practices, putting this all together to encourage students in the realm of expression and writing. So I got to meet many of those students. They came over to Moses Brown, and It was fantastic. I really want to salute what Raise Your Voice is doing in this state. It's really a model project. I wish every state had Raise Your Voice. I think they're creating something that many people could emulate.
Is this in the school systems?
Yes.
And it's taught in the language arts program?
Yes, and it's also being taught in, I believe, some after-school workshops and weekend workshops. Things have been going on all year. They've been having lots of visiting writers and poets who live in Rhode Island come in and work with the students. The students are, doing different readings of their own work. It was really terrific to get to meet them. I think they're also involving other arts as well, but writing has been one of the main focuses this year. And I want to salute Risa and Dorothy for their passion. They have a strong conviction that because of all the issues we have in the world, not only in terms of war in faraway places, but violence in our cities, that we need to be talking about nonviolence in a more active way, practicing it, discussing it as something we work on every day in our local community, on our block. We could use this in San Antonio, where I live now. We could use it all over the country. So I think Rhode Island has a great project to champion in Raise Your Voice. And I'm honored that I got to speak with some of those students and read some of their poems too.
When you were a child, you were being raised in Jerusalem at first, and so your context, and then you were in St. Louis.
Well, first I was in St. Louis, then Jerusalem, then Texas. So bouncing back and forth.
But the time in Jerusalem must have been astounding.
It was definitely the year that sticks, because everything opened up, the sense of my father's culture and background and so many relatives and a whole sensibility of the Middle East, which I had felt coming through him and people he knew, but I had never experienced firsthand. And then always thinking of the Middle East. I've traveled in many other countries and worked in many other in the Middle East, as a beautiful, real place of substance and precious care and hospitality and hope and intelligence and culture, all the things that we like to be proud of as Americans. People in the Middle East are also proud of, and it's very painful to hear people in this country who don't have much information about the Middle East other than violence and war, act with a sort of sweeping gesture, a dismissive gesture of, oh, those people over there, they don't, the things that you hear, that you pick up are shattering beyond measure, and you realize it's a lack of education. It's an ignorance. It's the way you could be dismissive of any culture or realm you've never experienced firsthand. And ever the more important that we share literature, food, music. People here on Block Island have been talking about that just today, and we all say the same things and believe the same things, that we cannot let the people who manufacture and exchange and sell weapons represent us. Those are not my personal representative. They're not yours. They're not the representative of children in the United States who go to school every day learning how to get along with kids who don't look exactly like them. I was so upset when the United States invaded Iraq in, 8 years ago now. I was really overcome with dismay at all times and talking about it avidly in schools I would visit. And it was so important, I felt. By the way, no one ever told me to stop. No teachers in public schools ever said, please don't talk about this. They would listen. They would say, our students are writing papers about what you're saying about media language, misrepresenting actual story. And I felt teachers were very hungry always to go deeper. No, we don't want to think of Iraq just as a place of let one bad man or his bad sons represent an entire country. Because we know we don't always feel so great about our politicians either. And so there was a strong feeling I had about reading Iraqi poetry in every classroom I entered and talking about Middle Eastern traditions and life. There had been many years when I never would march into a classroom and describe myself as an Arab American or talk about my father. Many times, working in Texas, people would say, "Hey, are you Latina?" And I'd say, "No, I'm Arab American, but I have studied Spanish and I can speak a little bit, and I've spent a lot of time in Spanish-speaking countries." So, there was always that little blur, who are you, what are you, we all belong to each other. But after 9/11, I did feel more of a responsibility to all the Arab American kids in the United States who were heartbroken and horrified by 9/11 to stand up for something better, representing the region, not just that despicable violence. So it was interesting, to be in a place like Nashville, Tennessee, and say, "I'm an Arab American. Are any of you?" And then have two little blondies with blue eyes raise their hands and then look at each other and say, "Really?" Not knowing that about each other. And I would think, well, that's my function now. I have to not only urge us all to speak, but also help people feel more comfortable identifying. And then, I'd say, you two need to be friends, and you need to know each other's families, and you need to share things about culture with your class. Don't be shy to do that because, bad things happen. Now we're called to be more responsible, to be more outspoken.
Do you have a poem that would talk about some of this? I know you said you wanted to read shorter ones.
Just little short
many
poems.
books, 38 books or something that you've
Well, I don't know. I think the
published
number's
now?
going up this week. I think it's more like 32 or
Okay.
something like that. Here's one called Dictionary in the Dark. This goes back to conversations we would have in classes, teenage girls writing papers on it can't be collateral damage if it's your mom. Dictionary in the Dark. A retired general said, "The beautiful thing about it, discussing war. We were making progress in our war effort. The appropriate time to launch the bombers pierced the A section with artillery as awe huddled in a corner, clutching its small chest. Someone else repeated, 'In harm's way,' strangely popular lately, and weapons of mass destruction felt gravely confused about their identity. Friendly gasped, fierce and terminal. It had never agreed to sit beside fire. Never." My father, sorry.
I was just going to say shock and awe
Oh,
was another
it was
phrase that
defaming the word awe.
which
Awe
is holy, yeah.
Yeah, it was like we were defaming language all along, as well as other people's cultures. My father, who was a print journalist himself, and all my life we had very strong conversations about the ways things are described in the newspaper, and he often had bitter disagreements with sort of covering up, masking a story, disagreements with other reporters or editors wherever he would work. So it was always around our dinner table, and my father was funny, though, to me in his brevity of response. When people would say to him, knowing he was a newspaper editor, "What are your feelings about Iraq?" He would say, "We should get out. We shouldn't be there. Get out. Get out." And they'd say, "Would you like to speak further about that?" And he would say, "No, we should be out. We have no right being in. We should be out." And I used to think, this is so interesting. My father, of so many words, is being so succinct on this one topic. And he said to me that he was so frustrated with all the talkathons on television, saying, and this is what we did today, and this is why we should be doing it or not doing it, that he was committed to remaining attached to that basic principle that it's not right to invade other people's countries and create havoc for them, even if they do have a bad ruler. And so I really respected his outspokenness, and he wrote some columns that were so outspoken that George Bush even called him at home to have a chat with him about his columns, and I thought that was pretty great.
That's amazing. Now, your father had some very interesting, terrible experience of occupation, difficult times as a child. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, in 1940, my father first grew up in Jerusalem as a mixed city, where Jewish, Arab Christian, Arab Muslim, Armenian, Greek children mingled, were friends. knew each other in the streets.
The navel of the universe is
Yes, it was the holy city for so many people, and it was also the secular city where they lived and traded candy and sweets and had joy and pleasure and hard times. And my father was very attached to the city of Jerusalem, and very attached to his family home, as his parents were. And then in 1948, they were displaced from their home and, sent out at gunpoint, and everything they owned was taken from them. They weren't wealthy, they were very middle class, but all the money they had in the bank was taken from them. They ended up with literally nothing, and never entered their home again. My father's best friend was killed in his presence by a Zionist soldier at the time, and so my father was marked with extreme grief at that early age. He had always been interested in traveling in his life, and he was the only person in his family then who said, well, I'm going away. I have to go away to study. And so he came to the United States as a student some years later. His family had resettled in a village, a small village where they owned this ancient ruined home that they settled in that had been sort of in the family for centuries. And that's where my grandmother ended up living to 106. They never went to a refugee camp, as so many of their friends and colleagues did. The refugee camps have been quite a disaster for Palestinians, certainly, and the hardship of life in camps should really be acknowledged by our country, which has contributed so heavily to the continuation of them. The unfairness of the entire situation about our government, for example, saying it's okay to throw all these people out of their homes and then we'll arm the people who did it and we'll support them all the way, was a great sorrow for Palestinian people and is to this day. My father always believed that Arab and Jewish people were cousins, brothers, sisters, needed to find a way to live together. But he was mightily opposed to the massive support of weapons that were used against his own people. And of course, the intifadas, which have sprung up, some people act as if out of nowhere. Why would people rebel? Why would they throw stones? Why would they be so upset? Well, in San Antonio, people get upset if you steal their trash can, much less their entire home. So I think
we fought a revolution as well.
Exactly. We fought a revolution. As Americans, we should be able to understand, as people who value our own property and our own trees, that if someone comes and cuts down all your trees and takes your home away, the odds of your immediate cooperation will be fairly slim, especially if a lot of people are ganging up on you. So, when the truth is known about what's really been going on all these years and how profound the oppression against the Palestinian people has been, it's not so hard for people in other countries to understand the sorrow, the legacy of sorrow, what's going on now. Edward Said, who was a great intellectual, professor in the United States, writer, spokesperson for Palestinian people in exile, he died a few years ago, alas, but his wonderful daughter right now is performing in a play she wrote in New York City, and I heard that the last line of it is, "Palestine makes me cry," because all of us who are children of parents who were cast out into exile or into the diaspora know how much this legacy of grief weighs in someone's heart, and really it shouldn't be that hard of a human thing to understand. My father always maintained hope of getting together again. He always said people must be sick of war at some point.
And your grandmother lived there, and you went to visit her. Do you want to read a couple
Yes,
of poems?
she always said, I never lost my peace inside. When people would ask her how she felt about current peace talks or the Israelis or that settlement she could see or those orchards which were cut down last week that she had been staring at and loving for 40 years, she would continue to invoke peace. She was a real practitioner of nonviolence. I mean, she never said, well, let's go fight them. She would say, it's not good. This is not a way to be. I loved my grandmother very much. She inspired many poems, and she was funny. She was a welcomer. She was a person people loved to know. And after her death, I met some Israeli professors of sociology who told me they had met her in their lives when they were studying Arab villagers, and that she had completely done a turnabout on them because they said, no longer were our subjects just subjects once we fell in love with them. And I thought, oh, that's so great. She would love to know these professors are talking about being in love with her. Red brocade. The Arabs used to say, when a stranger appears at your door, feed him for 3 days before asking who he is, where he's come from, where he's headed. That way, he'll have strength enough to answer. Or, by then, you'll be such good friends, you don't care. Let's go back to that. Rice, pine nuts. Here, take the red brocade pillow. My child will serve water to your horse. No, I was not busy when you came. I was not preparing to be busy. That's the armor everyone put on, to pretend they had a purpose in the world. I refuse to be claimed. Your plate is waiting. We will snip fresh mint into your tea. I used to sit with my grandmother for days and marvel at how anybody who came along, she didn't even have to know them at all or know what their purpose for travel was. Before we knew it, they were sitting with us around the fire, drinking tea, cracking almonds, laughing at her jokes. And I would sometimes think, who are all these people in the room? I'll never forget one night she put me in a bed to sleep and put a woman I had never seen in my life in the same bed to sleep with me and said, you two be friends, let her sleep with you. And I thought, this is so great. This is like, she carries it all the way. She doesn't worry about, any kind of separateness among human beings. If you appear and you're calm and you're interested, she welcomes you. I was with her once during a horrible tear gassing in the village, and I was panic-stricken. I didn't know what that meant to have tear gas thrown into the room, and my child was there with me, and I didn't know what was going to happen to us. And she calmly said, no. She we put perfume on these hankies, and we just cover our mouths. And she showed our son to do it. He thought it was a little game. We're all sitting there covering our faces with hankies. And another time I was with her when an 11-year-old cousin of mine, a child of one of my cousins, was brutally beaten in the shower by an Israeli soldier who was fully armed. And the boy came bleeding. We didn't know he was in 3 houses down. We didn't know what was going on. The little boy came bleeding into our house, sobbing, bloody nose, bruised eyes, sobbing. And my grandmother threw her arms around him and began comforting him and said, what happened? What happened to you? And he said, I was naked in the shower. And a soldier came in and beat me up in the shower with his gun hitting me, saying that I had thrown a stone yesterday. And I didn't. I was in school. I don't know anything about it. This is a child. And you think, the world wonders. Joe Klein in Time magazine 2 weeks ago wrote an essay about the Palestinians are really getting their act together. They're really being much better behaved lately. So maybe we should give them what they need. Maybe the world should look at the fact that they're behaving better. And I wrote a letter to Time magazine immediately, and I said, thank you, Joe Klein, for speaking up for the Palestinians. But if someone had been treating your family the way Palestinians have been treated for the last 60 whatever years, you might have a little bad behavior too. You never mentioned that in your story. You never mentioned that they've had a lot of reasons to be upset, just as if they didn't know how to act. And I think this is something that the Raise Your Voice project in Rhode Island is addressing. What are the reasons behind people's actions? What makes someone react to a situation violently? Well, that's what was modeled to them. That they saw someone else behave that way. But if kindness was modeled to them, how would they behave differently? Or in dialogue situations, when we start to argue, that's when we really need to keep talking. That's not when we need to walk out of the room and shut the door. So bringing this up over and over again, whether it's something in our own family, something on our own block, or something overseas, what more important work is there in the world? I do think poetry helps us with this work.
Can you read a couple other poems of yours that would help us to sort of conceptualize some of this or understand your viewpoint?
Well, I like still to write with pencils, even in a high-tech world. Always bring a pencil. There will not be a test. It does not have to be a number 2 pencil. But there will be certain things, the quiet flush of waves, ripe scent of fish, smooth ripple of the wind's second name, that prefer to be written about in pencil. It gives them more room to move around. I haven't made a toast to Lisa Starr and the Block Island Poetry Project. That's where we've been for the last few days, and it's been so magnificent to be part of this 7-year project on beautiful Block Island, Rhode Island, with people who've come from all over the place, including Switzerland and Vermont and Alabama, to write poems together. And I think there's so many wonderful places we can go to be together, but Block Island is certainly a precious one.
Lisa's been on our show a couple of times. Maybe you could say a little bit about how much Arabic poetry or other kinds of poetry have influenced you.
Well, all kinds of poetry of the world have influenced me. I've always tried to read poetry in translation from other places, and I worked for an Arabic translation project, but I worked only with English text because I'm not fluent in Arabic, for 10 years. And so I've read many, many Arab poets of all ages and ones who've died in past decades. And I would say they're a very strong influence because their hearts are so full and so rich with care for their world and their own lives, as our hearts are full of love for our world.
There seems to be a different way of saying things, though, that comes from the Arabic mind.
Well, the Arabic mind has a very melodious strain, and there's an old tradition of saying poems around a fire.
And largesse. There's a sense of largesse.
Largesse. And when you're crying out because of your sense of exile, you're also invoking everyone else who has ever lived in exile, and all the children who were cast out of their own parents' homes or cast out of their own lands for whatever reason. I mean, there's a sense of connection in Arabic poetry, and also a sense of longing, of enormous wistfulness. I was told that at the funeral of the great Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who died, alas, in my own state of Texas less than 2 years ago, his mother said at his funeral, he became the child of all of you, all of his readers. And she accepted that everyone in the world felt they were in his family, because somehow he spoke up for so many people who were disconnected from their home place or the places they longed to be. In our culture, too, I think we need to think sometimes about all the people who are imprisoned in jail and detention, who long to be at home, who long to have another chance, who would live different lives if they could. There are many great poetry projects in Rhode Island happening in prisons, and I've worked in some in other states. And, how many kinds of exile are there? How many kinds of hopes and desires for reconnection?
Writing helps that process, and you would advise people to start a journal and start writing, just no matter how well or how poorly they're doing, not to judge it at all. Is that right?
Absolutely. And read a lot and share your work.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for being with us. And thank you for watching Good News Rhode Island. We hope that you've had a good week, and we're sure that good news is right around the corner, and you will help to make it.